Okay, great. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Miloš Bošković, and today I will be talking about so-called Angular evolution, how it initially started off as headless meddler, and then grew to become superheroic assistant. And later on, I will explain that, of course. So first, a little bit about myself. I'm a lead front-end engineer in a startup called TrueDash. I'll explain that a little bit later as well. I used to be a full-stack developer when I started off development back in 2011. And back then I was working on PHP and JavaScript on the front end. I was using Laravel. Back then Laravel 3 was used, and later on 4. And then over the course of time I started working on some other projects which involved more front-end work, and after some time I completely moved away from back-end and started working on front-end completely. I work from my home, from the city of Niš in Serbia, and I really love it. I mean, working from home. So I'm not planning on going back to office anytime soon, probably, unless somebody really convinces me, but I don't think that's going to happen. And about the startup that I'm working for, so it's called TrueDash, and it's located in, it's based in London, but you can also pretty much say that it's operating worldwide because we have around 10 to 15 people who are involved in the project, and most of them are working remotely. It's a tool which is able to give you a complete insight into how your business is performing. And in the next slide, we're going to talk about that a little bit more. It started in year 2013, around December. And yeah, we're still working. We have some interesting clients. Backend is built on Java, Apache Spark, and MongoDB, but I'm not involved that much into backends. From time to time, I need to jump on just to take a look at how some controller is working or something like that, but most of the time, 99% of the time, I'm just working on front end, which is built on Angular 1.x. So it's a single page application. And 1.x meaning that we started off with version, I think 1.2, something like that, when we started off the project. And we were able to follow through all the versions of Angular that have been changing up to then. Of course, we haven't reached 2.0 because it's a major change. But right now, we're using 1.5.6, which is, I think, the latest version of 1.x Angular. OK, let's see what it really looks like, this application. So in plain words, we get a bunch of data, and we just crunch it into nice-looking charts. So that's what it does. We're mostly focused on big customers. So we're dealing with large databases of their own, and then we pull this data into our system, and we're able to apply all sort of different transformation to this data. We can take different metrics, different tables, different data, then apply formulas, group maybe some data. For example, you want to do a breakdown of how some product is sold over the year, and maybe you want to see some specific details about it, and then you can show that in forms of charts, bar charts, line charts, maybe tables, pies, and so on. You can also have these cards, as you can see, because there's several different cards with metrics. You can move them around, resize them, move them between dashboards, share them with your colleagues, and also put some comments on it, and so on. Also, you can, for example, create alerts. So if some parameter drops or rises, you will get a notification or email, and so on. Also, we are proud to say that one of the sponsors here, which is Ocado, is a user of our service. So they're also using TrueDash for their data analytics. OK, let's try it this way. OK, so before we get to the main story here, let's just do a quick revision of what Angular is, although probably most of us know it. So who is using Angular in everyday work? OK, most of you. So then you know that they like to call themselves superheroic JavaScript MVW framework. And MVW stands for? Yeah, whatever. OK, and you probably know that it was created in Google. I think it was part of their, I don't know what it's called, 10%, 20% initiative where you're able to work on your own projects. Do you happen to know the name of Angular creator, the one who started off work? I think it's Miško Hevery. Yeah. So he started off, and then this team grew bigger. Initially, he wanted to create something completely different. He wanted to create a tool for designers, so they can easily come up with HTML content and display it for their clients, so that clients can see working examples of HTML. That's how it started off. But eventually, it turned out to be a full-blown framework, so they ended up in some completely different place. Okay. So with Angular came also Angular so-called terminology. Actually, whenever you have some new concept, something new like framework, you have a bunch of new terms which come with framework. And I think that with Angular, it was a specific case because there were a lot of these terms and a lot of these new things which we needed to understand. And it tend to be overwhelming when you're just starting off and you need to understand so many different concepts, and that can be an advantage and disadvantage at the same time. So maybe it's cool because then you have this idea that you can implement things in different ways, so you have some sort of freedom. But again, it can be misleading because you don't know which way to go. Maybe you're not sure, maybe this is the better way because it's, I don't know, faster in terms of implementation, but more CPU consuming, or maybe this is the other way which requires more time, but it's more efficient and so on. So let's just go quickly through terminology just to see how big it is. The point is not to understand what it means, that's not the point, just to go over it. And of course, the terms that you're going to be seeing here, it's not all of them, there are much more. So, for example, dollar scope and dollar root scope. Because JavaScript has its own regular scope, but Angular has to have its own special scope, because regular is not enough. Okay, then there's this apply function, which is sort of private in terms that it's used internally in Angular, but from time to time you also need to use it, but it's better not to use it. But if you really have to, then you have to use it, right? Then you have services, factories, providers, which we know from design patterns, we know from other programming languages. But again, Angular has its own way of doing this. And now we have directives, which for me were a special challenge when I was starting off. And under directives, you have a bunch of additional expressions. So for example, DDO, which stands for, maybe, you know, you don't know. Directive definition object. It's not important anyway. Compile function, link function, pre-link function, post-link function. Okay, moving on. Require, transclude. Many people on Stack Overflow were wondering if this word actually exists in the dictionary. So do you know what transclude is? Not in terms of Angular, like generally speaking, as a word. Okay, well, it turns out that it comes from mathematics. And it's a combination of two words. Transform and include. So Miško thought it would be cool to include it in his, to transclude it in his Angular framework. So he uses this expression. Do you know what transclude does in Angular? I'm not asking you to explain, just do you have an idea? Do you use it? Okay, great. I'm not using it. But yeah, it can be useful for some specific user case scenarios. Okay, then you have config and run. And these tend to overlap in their functionality, so you're not always sure which one to use. And then you have filters, where you can filter stuff. You can filter, I don't know, arrays, then you can apply some numeric formatting or some other currency formatting. And you also happen to have a filter, which is called a filter. So it's a filter. Sort of confusing. Then you have modules, Angular modules. And you also have this broadcast emit, which is necessary in many different situations, so you really need it most of the times. Okay, moving on. So how do we benchmark front-end frameworks? And what I mean is, you have a new framework which just came out, and you want to know what it's like as a developer. You want to get a feel of it. What would you do, except for opening the website? What would be the first thing that you would implement in order to understand how this framework works? Any idea, any guess? Sorry? Okay, yeah, actually, yeah, Hello World does make sense, yeah. Anything else? What do you usually see in these sort of websites when you visit a website of certain framework? What application do you run into first? To-do application, exactly. So usually you have to-do applications, and that's how you sort of benchmark, like measure one framework against another one. Like how many lines does it take to implement a simple to-do application or something like that. So it's sort of a front-end framework test. So what I did in this presentation, I decided to take one to-do application from JS Fiddle, which I came across, and I decided to implement it in several different iterations of Angular. And when I say iterations, I mean several different versions of Angular, but we're not strictly speaking only about versions. We're also speaking about different style guides of how you should be writing Angular code. Because when you started off, actually when we started off in our company with Angular, the way you were implementing things was completely different from how we're doing it right now. And that's normal because things are changing, right? So I'm going to show you sort of evolution that we had in our company, and I think that it applies to most of Angular developers if they were following these style guides and trying to follow the versions. So we're going to be seeing how Angular has changed, and all the time we're going to be looking at the same business logic. So we're not changing anything in how the application is working. We're just changing Angular, we're switching to new versions, and we're also switching to different style guides, to actually different good practices. Okay, so from this, from the next slide onwards, there will be a lot of code, but please don't try to go through the code. That's not the point. The point is just to visually see what it looks like, and I'm just going to be pointing out some specific lines which matter. So it's going to be a lot, but there was no other way for me to do it. So there is no need for you to just go through the code. Just take a look generally, see what it feels like, just looking at it. Okay, so let's start with the first slide. Okay, it doesn't look that bad, actually. So on the left-hand side, you're always going to be seeing the JavaScript code, and on the right-hand side, you're going to be seeing the template which goes with it. So in this first example, I call it early Angular, is this to-do application which you saw from the previous screen, and that's how we would implement it. Okay, we are somebody who is just starting off with Angular. He just got maybe from jQuery world, and he would like to implement it, and he started off using Angular. And that's how he would do it, or she, a couple of years ago. So we have first of all, this is a variable which defines the whole application. I use true-app. You can use whatever, anything else. And then you have a controller, you define a controller, you name the controller, and then you pass this whole function inside you're going to be defining additional function. Actually, this is the sort of class, right? And then all of these functions are going to be available in your template to use. However, here you need to rely on dependency injection. So you need to inject this specific $scope, because back then that was the only way to make these functions available into the template. So you have to sort of meddle with Angular, or Angular is meddling in your own work, right? So you have to use it. There is no other way. Also, this line 30 is an interesting one, because that's an example of bad practice. That's how things are not done. However, if you're coming from jQuery world, it completely makes sense, because that's how you would do it in jQuery. And I was also making these sort of mistakes. I think it has happened to most of us, I guess. So that's an example of bad practice, but I just put it there, and later on we're going to refactor that piece of code. By the way, use strict means what? Okay, yeah, it's used. Yeah, it's going to report an error, but why is it going to be reporting errors? What's the point? I mean, why do we put it here? Yeah, so, okay, as it says, it's a strict mode, so it imposes on you some additional rules so that you don't write some gibberish, which earlier used to be okay, but now it's not okay anymore, like defining global variables, so the browser is going to let you know that that's not okay anymore, because now we're getting better programmers with newer JavaScript and so on. And also another, I'm just asking just for fun, these sort of questions, they're not directly related to the presentation. Why under quotes? Why didn't they come up with maybe just 2 keywords? Exactly, yeah, because of the vertical compatibility. So that in older browsers, if you were to come with new keywords, it would just break. But now if you just pass a string, older browser wouldn't care, new browsers will understand, so it all works perfectly.
So one question here.
Yeah.
So if you use strict on your files, and if you're So if you use strict on your files and there are some other libraries you are including underneath and they don't follow the strict, that will break your page?
I think this applies per file. So if you put them, I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
If you put them physical in the file, it's going to break.
Yeah.
But if it's separated, I think it's going to.
And if you minify everything together, then it probably will break.
Good question, and I think it will probably break.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
It's a dangerous one actually.
Yeah. Sorry?
In some ways, it's a bit dangerous one to use, unless you're putting it in the module or something, encapsulating it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay. So this is one version. So now let's try to implement the same thing a little bit differently. So now we finally get to realize how directives work. And I'm saying this way because for me it took me some time to understand how it works, how I need to implement it. So this is the same code, but now we're using a directive because that's what we were told on Stack Overflow. And the way directives work is, again, you define a directive the same way as you define a controller. You pass the name of the directive, right? And again, you pass the function, but this function is returning an object, which kind of doesn't make sense for a regular engineer. Like, why do you complicate things? Why wouldn't it just be an object? No, it has to be a function which is returning an object. Oh, and by the way, this object is the DDO, the directive definition object. So this is the one. So inside of this object, you have some restrict parameter, template URL, OK, controller, link. And back then, we were told, so that's what you would come across on the internet, that your DOM manipulation logic should lie inside of the link function, and your business logic should be in the controller function. So that's how we did it back then. That was the way to do it. HTML template hasn't changed much. It's pretty much the same. So now we have two different functions, and we are sort of splitting our work, our business logic. I mean, this is also some sort of a business logic. We're splitting it into two different functions, and we have now visually, just looking at the visuals, we have several levels of indentation. We have a function which is returning an object. It's sort of ugly, to be honest. OK, let's take one more step forward. Oh, now things look much better. But we haven't made that many changes here. Oh, OK, notification. Sorry about that. We haven't made that many changes here because what we did here, we just took the whole controller function. Well, first of all, we took the whole controller function, and we just physically took it out of the directive. But it's the same. We're still passing it here. Not many things have changed here. So that's the first thing. And thanks to that, you're able to, like when you open this file, you're able to just first see the thing that matters the most. And that's your business logic. And then only after that, you finally have the directive, which is not that important because that's part of the framework. So the thing that matters the most goes to the top. That's the first thing. The second thing is that finally, with this version of Angular, I think this was 1.3. I didn't put the version because I was not 100% sure. With this version of Angular, you finally have this bind to controller and controller as syntax. And with these two, you're able to get rid of the $scope, which is a small step. But now when you look at this piece of code here, you realize that this is vanilla, clear JavaScript. There is no more Angular here. So now finally, if you were to show this to somebody who is not from Angular world, he would perfectly understand what this code here does. Unlike the previous case where it's a bunch of Angular stuff mixed with your business logic. So it's much, much clearer now. It looks much better. Since we have controller as syntax here, in the template, HTML template, we had to make a couple of small changes where we need to reference the controller here and here in several different places. But other than that, not so many changes. So the key things here are bind to controller and controller as, and moving the whole controller outside. And of course, we no longer have jQuery manipulation. We managed to do this the Angular way, how it's supposed to be done. OK, let's take one more step forward. OK, so now we are looking at version 1.5 in particular. And this function here, because it's JavaScript function or JavaScript class, it hasn't changed one bit because there was no need for it to change. It would be funny if you had to change JavaScript code when you were just changing the versions of Angular. And here we have this new, as they call it, synthetic sugar, new definition which is called component, and it's just a wrapper for a directive. So in the previous case we had restrict element, and we had controller as, and we had bind to controller, and all of these now are implicitly defined. They're still there, but they're just implicitly defined. So now you're left with only 2 lines of code, just template URL and the controller. And okay, altogether it's 4. And finally, you don't have anymore this function, which is returning an object. Finally, they made things as they should be. It's just an object. You're just defining a component, and you're just passing an object. And this is getting better and better because it's just looking better. It's just easier for you to read. Okay, now let's put on top. Oh, one more thing. So here, because controller as is implicitly defined, it's set to $CTRL. Of course, you can define something else. You can put to do or whatever you want. Okay, so to make things even nicer, we can put some ECMAScript 2015 on top of this. So now we were able to get rid of even more clutter and more unnecessary keywords and so on. So you don't have any more function keywords, and you were even able to implement some for each loops in just one line of code, which for somebody doesn't look nice. I like that way of implementation. Of course, this is provided that the function inside of the loop is just a one-liner. If you don't like it, you can do it the old style. But anyway, the code is looking even cleaner and again, more easier. It's more easy to read it and to go through it. So this is version 1.5. And the next iteration would probably be Angular 2.0. And Angular 2.0, if you don't know, is a completely new framework, meaning that it was written from scratch. So they didn't build upon 1.5 and came up with 2.0. It's built from the very beginning, except that, of course, it adopts some of the principles that are coming from the old Angular. But again, it's written from scratch. So moving to 2.0 would mean that you're actually moving to a completely new framework. So how difficult would it be to switch from 1.5 with this syntax to 2.0? Well, let's just check out the difference in terms of this code here when we switch to this next slide. And it looks pretty much the same. Almost the same. Okay, not completely the same. This part here is identical, so no need to go through it. And here we're using a little bit of TypeScript, and we're defining this component. And we don't have a controller parameter, we have selector, but we still have template URL. And this is a completely new framework. But it was so easy for us to move from the previous version 1.5 to the new version. So let's just compare it one more time. Now on the left-hand side, you have the old Angular with directive, where everything is meddling with everything. And here you have Angular 2.0, just for you to see how much different these two are, and how much change has happened here. And this is probably a period of, like, well, in my experience, 1.5 to 2 years, as Angular was growing and changing. Okay, and now this is Angular 1.5 again compared to Angular 2.0. So now you see that it's almost identical. My point here being that if you have been following the evolution and the updates of Angular, then it should be not that difficult for you in some of the cases to move from 1.5 to 2.0. Of course, some things have changed a little bit more. For example, HTML templates are more different than the ones, significantly different compared to the ones in 1.5. And of course, you will be having some issues if you have some more serious applications where it's not going to be just piece of cake, just moving like that from 1.5 to 2.0. But if you have been following all the good practices, it should be at least much, much easier to move from 1.5 to 2.0. By the way, this piece of code, when you put it in, when you try to run it, won't work. Do you maybe know why it won't work? Probably you don't know. So if you know Angular 2.0, that is the reason. I mean, it's not related to that, but you need to know in order to understand why it won't work.
It's because the class decorator
it should be at the top. Yeah, exactly, thanks. So this part here should go here. I put it at the bottom so that it's easier for us to just compare 1.5 to 2.0. Okay, so as we have seen up to now, Angular has changed a lot, and right now, looking at this code, I think it's safe to say that it's much easier to reason about the code, it's much easier to understand the code, and it's easier to read it, just to go through it, just to take a look, and then it just makes much more sense compared to what we had with the old directives approach and so on. So it's easier to read. But why am I insisting on this like visual aspect, and why am I insisting on this like being easier to read and just to go through it? And I just keep talking about that and insisting. Well, because of this here. So that is a comparison between movie programming and real-world programming. By the way, it's a GIF with sound, but I didn't put the sound. With sound, it's much more interesting. So in movie programming, you're just typing like crazy. You're not even using spacebar, and the code is just pouring, like as you can see. And in the real world, it's not real like that. In the real world, you're looking at the screen, and you're just thinking to yourself, where do I put this single line of code so that I don't break anything, but still I get my work done? In most of the cases, it's like that. I mean, okay, not in most of the cases. If you're building something from scratch, then it's easier. But if you have a gigantic project and then you want to just make a small change but not break anything, well, in that case, yes, you're doing this. At least that's my experience. So that's why it's important for you. It's important for us to understand that you have to be able to easily read your code, to be able to go back to the code that you have written a couple of months earlier or something like that, and easily understand what it does. So that you can, again, easily, without too much because that's the sound actually, which is missing here, so that you can easily just put your code in and mark that task as complete. That's the main idea. And Angular, in terms of that, has changed a lot. Okay, so conclusion. Angular has come a long way. It has grown, improved, it has evolved, and it has become something much better compared to where it started from. I mean, a lot of people didn't like it because of tons of different things, and now they have less reasons to dislike it. It has become much more mature. And I think that with Angular 2.0, it's still keeping that direction. It's still going that way. And I think that things are going to be even better because they're planning to, they're getting rid of dollar scope and controllers and so on. I mean, you're still going to have controllers, you're just not going to have that sort of keyword and so on. So we should have even simpler Angular with much more power, as we have heard from previous presentations here. And where does that leave us as developers? What are we supposed to do? Well, we should do actually the same. We should also try to evolve, so to speak, or just try to learn as much as possible and try to find our own way as we are learning how to implement things and understand how to go through all of these changes. The worst thing that you can do is just, I don't know, maybe you start off with 1.2 Angular and you just stick with 1.2 and you don't care about anything else. Well, that would probably be the worst way to go. You should always try to implement something new, not at any price, because you always need to be cautious. Maybe it's not a good idea to switch right now to Angular 2.0, maybe it's still early, but you always need to have in mind that something is happening in the whole industry and that you just need to be aware of it and just to follow what's happening and then try to pick the things that may be useful in your own project. If you have not started with ES 2015, you should start. And if you're not using directives and components, I think that now it's the best time. I mean, you should do it even earlier, but now it's also a very good time to start using them. And also you should share the knowledge. When you look at your code from 1 year ago and you say, this is a complete crap, I don't know how I wrote this, that means that you have made a long way and that you have learned a lot over this 1 year. If you just look at it and you say, oh, I wouldn't change a thing, well, you haven't made that much progress, right? If you are working in a company and you want to maybe try this new library, but your boss is pushing you to get the tasks done all the time. He's always like, yeah, I understand, it's cool to have new libraries, but still we're under the deadline here. Can you please get this done, and then you can try this new library, and that keeps happening over and over again. Well, my advice to you, maybe a little bit controversial, is take some time off on your work and implement the damn library, even though your boss told you not to. Because what he cares about, what they care about, is just delivering the project, delivering the results to the clients. And the clients, they don't care if it's Angular 1.2 or 2.0. But for you as a developer, it is important. Because if you want to move up the ladder, you want to maybe switch jobs or ask for high salary, that's what counts. So you need to have that in mind. Okay, a couple of useful links. The first two are obvious. AngularJS, the old site for Angular 1.x. And the new one is called, by the way, it's called Angular. It's not called AngularJS anymore because they are focusing on server-side rendering and stuff like that. So they left out the JS part. You have this Angular style guide, which was written by John Papa and the community. And if you want to follow some good practices, my advice is that you don't need to necessarily follow all of them, but you should adopt some of them and stick to those. This to-do application, which you saw is available on JS Fiddle here. And have you seen JS What video? Okay, some of you have. So it's hilarious. It's very good. It's just 5 minutes long, and it's very interesting, and it's just talking about how crazy JavaScript is. The second one, have you seen AngularJS What? No? Okay, this one is even funnier. And it's a sort of a spin-off of JS What. So a guy who is doing AngularJS, he did AngularJS What. It's like 20, 25 minutes, but it's very interesting and really hilarious. Oh, and this last link is the one with the green code. So you just open this link and just start typing. And the code is just coming. Just for fun. Okay, thank you for your time. And this is the link to presentation. Questions, maybe? Yeah. Oh, microphone.
Hi. So, that's loud. Keeps happening. So, we are currently using sort of 1.3 in scopes, and it's all horrible. But that was written, we started working on that maybe like a year ago. But at the time, we didn't know anything about Angular. The guy who started doing it didn't know anything about Angular. So now we're in a state where it's getting a bit more mature, but I kind of feel like I need to say to my boss, look, we should just do all of these things because it's going to not be maintainable and we're going to need to change. And then when Angular 2 comes out, we're like really far behind. So I've got to do, ExpressScript 2015 refactor so it uses components, etc., like do lots of things like that. And reorganize the code base, and there's lots of things I need to do, but in your experience, what would be the best thing to say to my boss? Like, we need to move to doing components first, or 2015 first, or move everything in the code base around so it makes more sense, or what would be the best stepping stone or progression there?
So you're asking what would be the first step to do it, or how you would sell it to your boss?
Probably both. Would
Probably
be useful,
both.
Right?
I guess moving to ES 2015 is a good move. And as far as your boss is concerned, is he a tech guy or not?
Sort of, yeah, sort of.
Because if he's not, then you just say, in the long run, we're going to be spending much more money than we are now, and it's going to just cost more. So please, have in mind that that's one way. And if he's a tech guy, then I think that it should be just self-explanatory. He should just understand. But most of the times it can just boil down to money.
Sure.
And cost in general. Did I answer your question? Sort of.
Yeah, sort of. Just tell him money, money, money. And he'll probably
Yeah, I think that.
yeah,
but in my experience, when I had that sort of situation, I think that nothing helped. And in the end, I had to do the thing that I just mentioned. So, I would just take some time and I would just implement the thing that I wanted to implement. Even though he was saying, please focus on the task. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Just
Thanks. I'm curious about what's your take on the fact that Angular 2 is pushing TypeScript so much. It seems like there's no other option on using it.
TypeScript.
Yeah.
Sorry, the TypeScript.
Yeah.
TypeScript in Angular 2.
Yeah.
Or
See, it seems like the framework itself is campaigning so much with TypeScript.
so whether we should use it or not, that's what you're saying.
Yeah, what's your take on it?
Well, first of all, we are still, in my company, we're still far from going to Angular 2, which in turn means that we're not thinking that much about TypeScript. That's the first thing. But we are thinking, well, our case that we're thinking to moving to TypeScript in Angular 1.x. But that's a completely different story because that comes with some, a different set of issues. I think, well, it boils down to, I guess, personal preferences. I don't think that you can find a tech guy who would just tell you it's a complete crap, don't go with it, or you should definitely go with it. I don't think it would be a good piece of advice. Everybody has its own opinion, and I think what matters the most is how you personally feel about it or how your team personally feels about it. I think there is no correct answer, unfortunately. That's my opinion.
All right.
Anybody else? Okay, great. Thank you.